Namaste and welcome to Pods by PEI. This is Khushi and today I'm joined by Anusha. Hi
Hi,
Anusha.
Khushi.
We're both working on a research project titled Political Economy of Nepal's Youth Mobilization, in which we're studying the socio-political mobilization of young people triggered by the September 8 Gen Z protest. One of the most visible moments of youth-led public action in recent Nepal. What began as a flash social movement quickly raised bigger questions about leadership, legitimacy, and what political participation looks like for our generation and the current times. It was spontaneous, it was loosely organized, we call it rhizomatic in the sense that it was decentralized and in many ways very difficult to point down, and yet it drew people at a massive scale. And in the past 6 months, as young researchers and Anusha as an activist has been trying to make sense of what exactly shifted in that moment. And one of the most striking things we keep returning to is this idea of leadership, or perhaps the lack of it in this case. It's regarded as one of the hallmark features of this flash movement, the fact that it was leaderless. And I know there are some voices that are skeptical about this and they instinctively raise their eyebrows, saying that there's a larger conspiracy, young people were used as puppets for a larger end, and that might have its own research to be done and investigation that can be followed. But what ultimately makes that line of thinking feel irrelevant for us is that people didn't need a central figure to mobilize, and everyone had their own reason to show up. And that's where we want to start today. So between the two of us, Anusha, what brought you there on the streets on September 8th? Why were you at the protest?
Thank you for the question, Khushi. For me, I think I was actually not that aware of the whole thing that was going on in terms of protest until like maybe a couple of days before it actually happened. I was not on TikTok, and so by the time, and the social media that I used, which was Instagram, I was banned, so using VPN and everything, like I think I sort of got hang of it a bit later than a lot of people did. But then when I did see it, for me it was, I've lived abroad for a very long time, and when I came in, this was going to be the first movement or protest that I could be part of, that I could feel ownership of. One, because, like you said, it was leaderless, and I did not, if it was run by one person or if there was one central figure, then perhaps I may not have showed up. But that was one of the key elements, that, it was a mass of young people that were showing up, and for me, that was a really important aspect to it. And then, of course, the larger umbrella terms and the larger umbrella agendas, whether it is good governance or anti-corruption or nepotism, these are terms that may mean differently to different people. So corruption and how you experience it might be different than how I experience it. But even then, it's a larger umbrella term that many people can get, can find themselves under. And so that was one, I think. But the most prominent reason why I showed up was because, it was the protest of my generation, so to say. So I think that's why I showed up on that day. But actually, I really wanted to, pause on that, because before the movement happened, I'm on the older side of being a Gen Z. I never identified as Gen Z. I work with other Gen Zs much younger than me, and they feel like it's a central element of their identity, but I never felt that way. So I kind of wanted to pause on the term itself, how it's spread and how it's shifted culturally, the term Gen Z. And, from drawing from your experience as a young person online and your digital ethnography, how have you seen the meaning of Gen Z evolve over time?
Yeah, I think before I answer the Gen Z question, because it's related, I found myself in the protest as well because of the internet and the whole Nepo baby trend going around, talking about something that had always been there. And for me, it was really frustrating because, so for someone like you and I who study the social sciences and we're really focused on looking at social issues and we see how they're all connected. When I was observing or like participating in the Nepo baby trend, I could sense that people were making that connection of a certain style of lifestyle and a certain persona that we see on the internet is really facilitated by the real life experiences of corruption, and that connection making was really satisfying to me, and it felt very important that I take part in it. Yeah, in terms of the term Gen Z, I think at PEI we spend a lot of time thinking about how the term has shifted, which in the larger society I don't see many conversations about. Specifically, how the idea of Gen Z has sort of shifted from being a social category to a very political one. So, starting from its social origins, I think Gen Z as a term we all know by now that it's used to denote a cohort of people born from 1997 to 2012. But I don't think Gen Z was, like you said, a social metric used in Nepal in real life, as it is right now. So because the Nepo baby conversation was, by virtue of being a trend, happening online, and there was a strong youth engagement, Gen Z became a term, a vehicle for gathering ownership of sorts of the movement to collectively name frustration and mobilize against corruption. And at the same time, the fact that Nepal's gerontocratic leadership is really gerontocratic and concentrated within a specific group of old bound men, this really became a clear point of contrast, reinforcing that age-based framing. Yeah, and up until the protest, Gen Z functioned primarily as a social label, and as every social label does, it could curate a sense of solidarity, belongingness, like you said. Gen Z is also fresh and pop and catchy and culturally resonant for people who are online. And this reinvigorated this very cliched and jaded idea of youth in Nepal. So I remember that for a very weirdly long time, people from the older generation couldn't understand or grasp what a Gen Z is or who a Gen Z is. And this mystique, sort of, really led to the cultural dialogue around, created a hype around Gen Z and supported this, worked towards the favor of the movement. The term itself started gaining more political colors once the incumbent government was out, and the remaining government needed someone to present the political mandate. And the political mandate was represented by these young folks, and this term Gen Z sort of emerged as that. And suddenly, after the September 9, once individuals were called to the army headquarters and once they were in conversations with the interim government, the idea of Gen Z suddenly became very political, and it started functioning as a political group, which now had political capital because of the movement. They had political stakes because they had an agenda, and also political engagement. So that's how they evolved. But as I talk about this, one thing that was really clear was, because you're using an age-based label as a political label, you find yourself with a lot of ambiguity around the agenda, because this is not something that stems from political philosophy, but from a social category. So this called for a lot of different claims over who Gen Z are and what their agenda is, and sort of invited people, or sort of necessitated that they organize. And I want to talk about this with you. At that point, after September 9, what forms of engagement was necessary for Gen Z to step into?
Yeah, I actually, when you mentioned about when Gen Z became a political construct or a political category, I remember in the aftermath of the movement, and it was one of the first times a lot of people had heard the term Gen Z. I mean, it's a really, it inundates specific ages, maybe algorithms, but maybe not so much in other people's, even social media, perhaps they might never have come across the term itself. And I remember, and I'm sure you do as well, but after the movement, everybody started identifying as a Gen Z, even, older political leaders or even civil society members who would tell us that, I was a Gen Z once, or that kind of a sense of ownership. I think that's the word that you used, that I feel like that's very interesting. At the same time, because the meaning of it in our context, perhaps in Nepali society, was not very clear, it sort of started gaining its own meaning, and that is really interesting in terms of how it played out later on. And coming into, when I remember in the beginning phases when we were just starting to get organized, I mean, this is something that we've talked about, that the movement actually happened through mobilization and then the organization came afterwards. In the beginning phases of that, I remember having a conversation with a lot of different stakeholders in society, and these spaces did open up for young people to engage with perhaps people they would have never engaged with the way our society was going politically, socially, and like you rightly mentioned, it's a very gerontocratic society in terms of who we hold legitimate, or who we give political legitimacy or intellectual legitimacy or whatever it may be. And so all of a sudden this new group of people became visible, became politicized, and this constant question of, okay, what is it that you want? Like, we just don't understand. What is it that you want? And I think that really stuck with me, that, in some ways, everybody wanted a better society, and which is why, like, it was a easy mobilization that a lot of people managed to come together, because it seemed like a lot of people wanted something to change, like change is what we wanted, right? But of course, like, then slowly as we started having these conversations in more spaces and in more rooms, that okay, perhaps change may not seem or mean the same to everyone. And I think that is also something of an important realization to have. And the group that I sort of joined or was a part of and then continued to work on later on, we started, we identified ourselves as a group which had a very specific, foundational, I guess, ideological elements, that we wanted change, but it's not that we wanted to completely overthrow the system that exists, but rather to improve the system and to better the system and to, work on evolving it. And so that included us saying that our pillars are federalism, inclusion, democracy, republicanism, and secularism, because these were foundations that we felt when we entered into these spaces they were being questioned, and we were like, that is not, that is not what we agree with. And so similar to us, there were other groups who had similar thoughts, that okay, what, we came in as one bunch, and there was an eruption, there was a rupture in our society, but then when we organized, then there has to be some intersecting elements, that there has to be places where we can connect with each other. Because one of the hardest things at the very beginning was not just this question of what is it that you want, but rather why are you not together, all of you? You should all all be together, and there should be, one mandate that everybody signs into, and are you with this person or not, are you with that person or not, why are you also divided? But it's natural that we're not of the same, whether it is ideological backgrounds, and a lot of people came into, and you said this at the very beginning, that there were many reasons that people came onto the streets for, and for people to identify groups or organize groups based on what is it that they showed up on the streets for. I think perhaps that was a way, and you can see that groups organized regionally, whether you see groups that are more locally organized or identity-based groups, and those have their own meanings, right? And they have their own importance in why they organized the way they did. And so it was really unfair, I felt, or I couldn't grasp my head around this question of why is it that you are not all together, because there simply was no way that we will be ever either. We all come from very different backgrounds, and of course towards the end we ended up, maybe the group started being consolidated more, and like smaller groups started combining into one, as we can see in our research as well. But I think the organization became very important to clarify and to tell the public as well as the state what is it that we want. And I think without, and that really led us to being able to sign a mandate with the government as well, with the interim government, the agreement that was signed.
So when you found yourselves organizing and you were creating this task lists of sorts to address. What was on the table? What were the things that Gen Z groups had to tend to?
So I think like it was very clear to us at some point that, you know, the rupture, everybody was having a very hard time wrapping their head around what the rupture was about and what it means. And, you know, and for us, for the most part, almost half of the time after like the interim period between the fall of the then government and then the new government's coming into power, when the interim government was in place, half of the time was, you know, working with different stakeholders of society, having these conversations about, you know, this movement needs a safe landing, and, you know, we need to institutionalize the demands of the movement, that it is a movement. And, you know, like it is very difficult for us to wrap our head around this because, yes, it was a very decentralized movement, and, you know, we're more familiar with the kinds of movement where there is a central figure or a central group that runs the activities. And so I think these were the conversations that were happening on a daily basis, you know, and with many different stakeholders. So whether it is media, whether it is civil society groups, whether it was political leaders, you know, some groups were organizing conversations in provinces about, okay, what is it that, because even during the interim government period, there was a lot of uncertainty, right? There was uncertainty about whether the elections were going to happen or not, whether it was going to be free and fair elections or not. So all of these different concerns were there, and I think different Gen Z groups took upon, you know, themselves, and it was their responsibility, perhaps, that they felt that they organized these conversations on provincial levels, you know, talking about, okay, what exactly is the system of our country? Like, what does it mean that we're a federal nation? Why that is important? Or whether it is about constitutional knowledge, you know, what specific things in the Constitution means for the current situation that we're in. Why is it that we're looking into the Constitution, right? I think that was, to me, a very interesting element of my experience, is that I've never been close or around the legal fraternity, and all of a sudden after the movement, you know, so many of my friends come from a legal background, and all of a sudden, like, I am talking about, you know, okay, in the Constitution of this line and what that means, and I think that knowledge itself was also very interesting. So I think in terms of raising awareness, there were many activities that were happened alongside, I think, regular, you know, like relationship between the state and Gen Z groups was also very close. I think one of the things that happened, what I feel, is that after the movement, there was a short period of time when perhaps the state and the people were very close to each other, and that doesn't always happen. And I think that was a really interesting moment. And whether that is, you know, the state's apparatuses, bureaucracy calling us in for conversations, or whether it is, you know, us calling them in for discussions, I think those were the ways that different Gen Z groups were engaged. And of course, there was a large group that was on the streets, you know, they were demanding different things, and the streets was very much alive in that point, and it was alive with young people. Having said that, actually, I really wanted to talk about this as well. Not everybody had the same access. I think that is very important to understand, that, you know, the access to, whether it is the state, whether it is access to political capital or visibility, whatever it may be, it was not that, oh, anybody who came onto the street that day had that access. I think that is a very important thing to remember. And, you know, there are so many layers of inequity deep within this as well. And, you know, if we talk to our colleagues and our friends from outside of Kathmandu, already, you know, that the centralized nature of this whole thing after the movement happened. I mean, the movement in September 8-9 was successful because it was a nationwide movement as well. You know, it erupted as a whole throughout the country. But then later on, when the organizing and when the building of the political capital, all of that happened, it was very much centralized in Kathmandu. So people had to fly in here, people had to come in here, take very long journeys just to show up and to show that, okay, you know, we also are politically engaged and we are also stakeholders. And I think that has been one of the biggest lessons for us and a biggest reflection for people in Kathmandu, to realize how much space still Kathmandu takes over the entire country. I think that to me was very important. Oh, and I think actually, you know, I wanted to ask you that because we've spoken to a lot of different clusters of Gen Z groups, and you have done so as well. I'm curious, what were some of the similarities, what shaped, their emergence of these clusters? Like, how did you, based on your conversations, like, why did people choose to associate with one group versus the other?
A lot of your previous answer actually addresses what you're asking to me, which is how people were deciding to cluster up and which groups to associate themselves with. And across almost all Gen Z groups, what matters the most is for individuals to choose is pre-existing horizontal networks. So this can be as informal as being friends at university or school, or collaborating or working together previously in a fellowship or some form of political apprenticeship. And this is crucial because, one, at this moment when everyone is, so at this moment where there's like high political volatility, right? You never know what the other person is going to stand up for suddenly. People, individuals, young people really wanted someone they could trust and rely on. I remember one of my interviewees framed it as baggage, ideological baggage, and when he was in the process of deciding whom to work with, he was really scared of being surprised or ambushed by this weird political ideology that he does not agree with. For example, working with someone and then later finding out they are pro-monarchists or have some really troubling ideologies about feminism and women and their position in society. So this was a conversation that they were, at an individual level, people were thinking about. And so to sort of overcome that, relying on pre-existing relationships and networks really helped them. And also trusting this person who you have worked with before, you're more familiar with their working styles, you're more familiar with what the quality of their work is, how they show up or don't. So all of these are really clues into making sure that once you've clustered up, you're doing good work. Another similar conversation they were having with themselves is about legitimacy. So who is the legitimate leader or group of this movement? Or some people frame it as streets. Who was on the streets that day? So someone like Raksha Bam, for example, has a lot of credibility because she was the most visible on September 8th. And that idea of legitimacy people were thinking about as they were trying to decide where to engage and whom to sort of be loyal to. But obviously, unlike political factions and political parties, this is not like a clear-cut, mutually exclusive groups. I think how Gen Z groups have existed so far can really be boiled down to their functions and the type of capital they have. Some groups, by virtue of having members who were more socially active in the media and had that kind of media capital, have used that. And some other groups who have people from political parties, youth wings, previously politically active people have that political capital of being able to meet with at least lower tiers of politicians. Whereas some others might have like this background in development work and have this project management skill. And so the groups are divided more in terms of their functions, and wherever an individual sees their function, they can always move boats. So it's not as steadfast as it was traditionally. But that said, what is very interesting about the up-and-coming Gen Z groups is that they're really steadfast on doing some things differently than how they perceived things were done. And so one of them being they do not want a vertical organization, in the sense that they do not want a structure where there is someone residing at the top, rhetorically, figuratively, functionally. They want the responsibilities and also the power within the organization to be distributed horizontally, and it has its own perks and also challenges. But I want to ask you, Anusha, what are the things that within Gen Z groups people are trying to think about differently?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point in terms of how people want to organize, or looking at systems. Like, we've seen the way structures have been set in place for such a long time, right? And the way people have decided to organize now is a direct, like, we don't want to be them. I think perhaps like that's one of the things that, at least for me, that's how I felt. And we went onto the streets because we talked about accountability, we talked about the lack of power sharing, the consolidation of power in the hands of very few, and then, whether it was the consolidation of power and wealth, right? When we talk about nepotism, and I think like that already was a very interesting political culture shift. If young people were organizing in a way that we do not want one specific face, like we can represent our, and I think that really was striking also when certain faces emerged after the movement as the leaders, but then when people said, no, this person is not my leader, because we all went to the streets, almost as we went to the streets horizontally, for lack of a better word, like we went onto the streets representing ourselves, and it wasn't like following a face. And so I think like that really is a culture shift. In terms of course, the challenges, like you said, there exist quite a bit when organizing horizontally. I think what we're doing differently perhaps is also, the sense of reflection that we perhaps might not happen all the time, but then there is this like cycle of accountability that is existing from right from the very beginning, that there are certain groups that are organizing in a certain way, but I think it's not that the accountability has only been towards the state. There's been a sense of accountability even within groups, like holding the other one accountable or holding people within your organization accountable. And of course, like you very correctly pointed out, like a very volatile political environment. Of course, everything is murky in many ways and uncertain and unclear. Perhaps that's also something. But I think that's a really, the fact that your counterparts, you see them not as they're your colleagues, they're your counterparts, right? And I think that sense of accountability, I feel, is there. I think the other thing is like recognizing the centralization of power, and everything in Kathmandu does exist. So in some points, like, people are sort of going into local levels or, provincial or even smaller. And I think that is also a very interesting element, is like recognizing, there are people outside of Kathmandu, and that's a very important element to the movement. And at the same time, I feel like in many ways, groups that are local are doing very, like they've really strong organization. Like in Kathmandu, this is just an observation, but it feels like it's more loose. But from our conversations with people who've been organizing locally, they have a very strong presence in their region or in their locality, and I think that is really I think a big lesson for us, for other people who are organizing. I think something else in terms of how Gen Zs are doing things differently, and it begins with how the movement even happened, right? I think digital space and this taking over, the medium is completely different. I mean, yes, there are like in-person meetings and we gather, but a lot of things are, propelled, and the digital space has become active. It's as meaningful and legitimate of a political space as the street almost. I think in some cases, the street, you have to be physically present, but I think the way the movement happened and the way it gained all its legitimacy online, I think that even post-movement we can see that young people are, gathering online, doing events online, like everything that you thought, previously would have happened in person is very much, we've taken up a completely different space. So I think these are some of the really unique ways that young people are organizing now. And I actually wanted to ask you, I mean, you've spoken to quite a bit of different Gen Z groups. How, like from your vantage point, like when you've spoken to them and when you've observed them, what stands out as the key strengths of the people, and how have you seen that, young people mobilizing and making the most of very limited resources to create and sustain space, because I mean, resources are a big factor as well when it comes to organizing and mobilizing.
What you said about like the moment, the rupture having this impact, I want to build more on that because I think a lot of the response to this question lies there. After post September 8, previously we talked about how Gen Z became this buzzword and took over like the cultural zeitgeist and vocabulary, and the political barrier for entry for young people had like drastically disappeared almost, because everyone had the onus to include young people after what happened on September 8th. And so that gave them a lot of opportunity to come in. And yes, there are various intersectional realities within that. Some individuals within the youth having more access and capital to engage there. But even that, I think over time through organization, a lot of different parts of the youth cohort, different members were able to join in and engage. And so that being said, even within that context, there were a lot of strategic moves that young people had to make in order to gain legitimacy, credibility, authority as a new group, especially in a society where young people, because Nepal being this having this age-based structure and hierarchy, young people are, at least till now, were disenfranchised in many ways, especially in terms of decision making. So some of the ways that they went about this was, again, going back to those networks. So although young people were not able to enter the more formal public spheres of decision making and state building, they had been working on things of that sort in their own spheres. And this is a result of globalization and young people being able to access other avenues besides what is locally available. So things like international fellowships or trainings, various forms. So that helped them create networks not just within their group and their cohort, but also outside with the media, for example, or with other INGOs and NGOs who have the resources and ideas about how to work in a situation like this. And so having networks in the media especially gave them a lot of access to legitimacy, because they were able to competitively build that narrative of what is happening. Because post September 9, I think there were a lot of efforts to sort of dismiss what had happened and focus on the wrong details, like I started with, right? And Gen Z, through their networks, they were able to curate media attention in a way that persistently focuses on the fact that the state response was disproportionate, anti-corruption, and young people had very real reasons to protest. Besides that, I think previously you talked about scale and not being Kathmandu-centric. But I think at least after 2 months, Gen Z caught up on the fact that they need to be more in numbers to sort of be representative and hence legitimate. And so there was a lot of effort in making sure that voices from the provinces were represented. A lot of the big Gen Z groups have their own provincial wings, regional representatives. And even though it's not the most perfect, they've been able to engage them in whatsoever ways. So something like, I think, Sagar Dakal's tour across different districts, right? That was a publicity thing. I don't want to call it a stunt, but that was him and his team and team of other individuals, like renowned Gen Z individuals, trying to curate credibility and trying to be that voice of the normal Nepali. What we cannot discount is the fact that individuals in Gen Z groups are extremely capable. They are well-trained lawyers, they are social scientists, they have worked as journalists, and so all of these skills that had never found an appropriate platform to be worked at suddenly had this platform, right? They were working on the 10-point agreement, they were working on the good governance blueprint, they were working on reporting how things were going. So we cannot discount the fact that capacity played a big deal in legitimizing young people's mobilization. And finally, there are other things such as digital campaigns. That is something young people are really good at doing. And I think maintaining And this again goes back to narrative, maintaining that narrative in the popular audience, within the popular audience, that this is what Gen Z is, and really doubling down on that help them gain the miles as well. That said, I know I started this response by saying that the political climate post September 8th led to a lot of these doors opening for young people. And that, as we talk, 6 months, 7 months after the protest, is really on the decline. I've heard that young people are struggling to work with this, with different state interfaces, because suddenly the Gen Z agenda has been conflated with elections, and now that the elections are done, why are you still here? And so what does it mean for Gen Z to move on into this post-election era? What forms of engagements do you see Gen Z groups being active in, and how will they be relevant?
Yeah, I think that's really important to recognize that, I mentioned this before, that there was a very small window where the state and, people had the chance to work very closely together. And not just that, specifically Gen Zs, because in general, I think young people having that access already, right? I think now that's definitely changing, because a lot of people have said that even the friends, that even the counterparts who've been on the streets with them, or they've been part on this side, because some people have gone into the parliament, it's hard to reach to them as well. And I think that's really interesting switch, and I think that is something that we have to watch out for. I mean, and there's quite a lot of different elements here, right? We have election results that perhaps surprised everyone, in terms of a government that is basically without a legitimate opposition. And what do we do in that case? I think a lot of the people, we had conversations about this as well, and everybody was preparing for a coalition government, and we were thinking about, how that is going to happen. I think that's where everybody's headspace sort of was. And when the election results did come out, I think it really, it shifted once again. Something else shifted in our political climate, and all of a sudden there was this very important recognition that, okay, in lack of a credible opposition, we have to work, as whether it is civil society members, or some other capacity. And so I think now that the elections have happened, and the state, we're moving towards some kind of a stability as a state, there has been, just like post-movement during the interim government, there were different avenues that Gen Zs decided to insert themselves into, whether it is working with the government directly, whether it is working as a civil society member, work more in awareness, or as political stakeholders on the street. So there were different spaces that people occupied. I think the nature of that still remains. There are some people who have found their space within the government, in the secretariat or in other capacity, whereas some people have become more active on the streets, and then other people are now feeling, okay, we'll organize better, we'll register ourselves, that's the role that we will play. And I think all of that, having said that, I think there's really this important role that Gen Zs and together actually with the rest of the society, not just Gen Zs, is the role of an opposition, but also, ensuring that the government does not forget the mandate that brought them there in the first place. And that requires, very strong accountability, very strong, support as well. I think accountability to a point where, we're just perhaps creating a space where, how do you say, do not support the government that 2/3 of the country has put in place. I think that is also something, keeping aside everything else, it is very important that the government has what it needs in order to continue and to ensure that the people's mandate, they work on it, and they work on it successfully. And, I think that's one thing. So I think the role is going to be more on the accountability side, playing the role of, holding a mirror to the government. And of course, that will have to be, we'll have to figure different ways out to it. If the distance between the state and the people keeps growing, then there'll have to be other ways that we engage with the state. And what is that going to be? It's going to be very interesting because we're still in the very beginnings of it, and people are building tools. I mean, I don't know if you've seen, there are these tracking tools that people have come up with. It's called digital opposition, and they're just tracking what the government is doing in the first 100 days, because the government gave a 100-day work plan basically. And then I think those are the ways, like, we are really in this process of state building in some capacity, even though I think there is some distance. But that distance, I think, has to be very closely monitored in terms of how much it grows, because that's also dangerous, and like the state completely being detached from the movement that put it there. I think that is also something very important to watch out for, I feel.
It comes up again, the fact that the internet, and you can create tools on it. And this again goes back to what I was saying about digital capacity and the youth, and this new way of civil society, or like the civic space becoming more digital. And there are just so many things that become accessible because of that digitalness. And it remains to be one of the greatest advantages of young people. What I do want to ask further about is sustaining this work, right? You said it's important to make sure that the state is aware of its origins, and to sort of stay loyal to the mandate that brought it forward. But also so many other things that the new cohort of civil society wants to do. All of this needs funding. I know during the last 6 months, I know so many individuals who are working out of pocket, who are taking time off from their work. And all of this, because of that political moment, the urgency of that moment, I think they rationalized it on a personal level, but it cannot be sustained. And so in order to access all these fundings, in Nepal, there's already an industry of aid and accessing that aid. But there is a resistance among this group of young people to access that, because they associate NGOization with a certain negative connotation, right? Why don't we go over some of those reservations? What is at stake when you register yourself, when you register a movement?
Yeah, I think this is very, it's a conversation that is ongoing in, I think, many of our circles. Like, what do we do next in terms of how we organize? And I think it's very difficult when a movement is registered and, you're bound by specific restrictions that come with it. You're a political actor, and how much of that changes or is restricted when you're functioning under a specific, because registering is like also, it's we're students of political economy. I mean, what does it mean to register your organization with the government? I mean, it's a very interesting dynamic, right? And I think that definitely is one of the struggles of why, whether we register or not. And when we don't register, there is other specific set of challenges. I mean, whether it is accessing funds, but then at the same time, like, the question is, what kind of funds should people be open to or not? Because we're fresh out of a movement that has had its own set of, like at the very beginning you said, theories about whether, what was involved or who was involved. And I think in this general climate of lack of public trust, I think that's a very important thing to remember, that, we have, before the movement, we're a society with very little public trust, or our public trust has eroded quite a bit, whether it is towards the state or whether it is towards really anything. And this government, when it came in, one of the things that put the government in, that got RSP so much votes is public trust as well. But you have to maintain that. It's not going to stay the same forever, obviously. But beyond that, I mean, there is a lack of public trust towards other institutions, towards other apparatuses. And I think that is something that really, we have to consider as a movement, as groups that are organizing, that where, until when do we have public trust? Do we have public trust already or not? And, we're always careful in terms of, okay, if we were to register and, have a very specific path or a chart that we take in terms of how we access funds or how we organize, then will we become the same as others who were later on delegitimized in the past? And does that mean that we will slowly lose the trust that people have in us as well? And so I think those are really fundamental questions that groups and the movement and the people are facing, because like you said, it's very difficult to organize where in a country where civil society does not really get any sort of support much, I would say. And I think I don't quite have an answer in terms of if there's one correct answer or not, but these are fundamental questions that all of us and a lot of people who are involved in the movement are grappling with. And in many ways, even people within the movement, for some of them, it's not just about resources, whether it is financial. It's also, we haven't talked about the emotional burden, the mental burden, everything that has come along with all of this. Like, there's been really no space for care that people have given to themselves, because all that has been reserved for the state or for the country almost. And so when you said before that people rationalized doing everything out of their pocket because that was the need of the moment. But I think these are some really existential questions that young people are facing, and I wonder, how with as we chart on this course of 5 years, hopefully the government is going to run its course, how is the civil society going to grow along with it? Because that opposition is very, very important. Yeah.
In this regard, one, a lot of the individuals, many of the individuals who were engaged have been absorbed into the formal government, right? Either as MPs or secretariats, or even through the state and bureaucracy. And so what we are left with is a much smaller group, and also more interested in collaborating, I think, because I think that phase of political aspirations and trying to be at the right place at the right time, we're sort of over that. So the other thing is, yeah, there are innovative ways. So in my conversations with different people who are looking to continue their organizing and continue to be on the streets, they're coming up with ideas, maybe social enterprising, having this wing where you're creating some form of profit that goes into the organizing. Some people are inspired by the DSA in America, right? And also not just in terms of how to sustain the movement, but also how to engage with the state more innovatively. And this doesn't have to be just lobbying or protesting. This can be culture through art. And so those are a lot of the things that they're thinking of as well. I think something that we need to talk about here is the previous generation of civil society. I know they've played a role in nurturing some of the actions and advocacy of Gen Z so far. What are your thoughts on that? How can they support, or even before that, what has their presence been like so far? And moving forward, what kind of support can they offer?
Yeah, I mean, from the very beginning, we've been, at least, the circles I've been a part of, we've been very clear that it's not possible to do this on our own. And that's also not the point, to do this on our own, right? It's, we worked, whether it is mobilizing or organizing, there was a general sense that everybody is feeling this, which is why it was a movement. It was a people's movement. And as we said, Gen Z has become more than just an age definition. It's a political category now. And I think at the very beginning, when we were organizing, one of the biggest allies we found were in civil society members of the previous generation. I think whether it is from a knowledge sharing basis, whether it is sharing resources, whether it is giving or creating spaces, what you mentioned before, as spaces that produce or give legitimacy, whether it is media, whether it is conversations, open conversations or discussions. I think those were spaces that like the previous generation have helped us create. And I think like that has been really, really important in terms of sustaining the movement as well, and also keeping the sustaining doesn't mean just in terms of like whether it is finance or anything, and even like willpower, I think that has been very important. And in some cases, of course, like some people have been supported financially as well. Some of the people that we've spoken to have mentioned it. And I think continuing onwards, I think the civil society remains as one civil society, right? I mean, it's not the older civil society and the younger civil society. And so I think like sort of finding, but at the same time, there are flaws, and what happened to the civil society in the country all this time is a big question, and that's a big reflection to have had as well. And so that sort of, whether you call it reconciliation or whether you call it conversation, I think that is something very important to have had. And the other thing is like moving forward, continuing to organize together as across generations. I think that will be very important, and I think that's with their experience, but a lot of like the context and the mediums have also changed, and I think there's a lot that the older generation can also learn from the younger generation, like you correctly pointed out, in terms of how we organize, or how young people are great at maneuvering. If there's not one thing, then what's the next thing, and if there's nothing, then how do we make, so I think that kind of creative and productive way of organizing is things that perhaps the older generation can also learn from the young people. And I think like just in general, this is something that I've been feeling like I think it's very important to redefine what the civil space or civic space in Nepal looks like, because we are in a very different kind of time with election results that have not had similar numbers since the first elections that happened in this country. And so I think in that case, what does a civic society, like a civil society, mean in this country? How can we think differently? I think these are exercises that need to be had, and I think in that way the older generation can really engage with the newer group that has come up. Yeah, but I think I actually wanted to sort of, when you said before that, quite a bit of people have entered, whether it is the government or bureaucracy, I think perhaps the civil society is still much larger, people who did not go into these spaces. And so just the sheer number of people outside of the state apparatus is quite large. And I think that is one of the biggest strengths, of course, of civil society in general. Yeah.
I think we started this conversation by saying that there has been a shift. What is that shift for you?
I honestly, very personally, I feel like I've studied. I was very academic. I mean, I was in academia until a year before the protest happened, and I've not even a year before. And so I think for me, the shift, along with political shift that's happening in the country, that is situated within a global shift that's going on, there's also something very personal about this whole thing. I've been working in this for quite some time now, and sometimes I ask myself, I have not had the time to check in with myself in terms of whatever I've read basically was on the street on September 8th and 9th, and to me even the coming together of that was a very interesting process, like me reflecting on that. I think in terms of the country and the shift that has occurred here, I feel like right now I'm in a place where I'm choosing hope, also because 2/3 of our country chose hope, and I think it's I'm realizing it's an active choice in many ways, of course, but for me I think there's a lot of space for us to, like, the idea of state building is very interesting for me, even theoretically, and I think for now the shift sort of provides this space to even have that exercise in some ways. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, I think that's where I'm at right now, but still trying to figure out on a personal level what that shift means for me. What about you?
I think for me, who hasn't been as engaged on ground levels, and I've mostly been, and this is what I prefer as a researcher, being more externally positioned, and the whole time it felt like I'm observing this huge socio-cultural shift in the position of youth in Nepali society, because I think I said this before as well. Think about the Nepali family and think about the younger people within it, and they although they function fully as adults, they have a job, they'll do the household chores. A lot of the decision making is not to them. Um, and so that dynamic sort of percolated throughout the different spheres of society, be it at a job, at the government level. There's always this kansa kansi tendency of like placing young people, and I think that we're moving away from. I think now people are seeing 25-year-olds as MPs. The parents are realizing how socially aware their kids are, how much of politics they know, how much they care about these larger macro phenomena. And the term Gen Z itself, I know for a while it was, at least in my circles, it was used as a term of mockery by the older generation. But I think there has been a shift in how the Nepali society views young people's capabilities, their capacity to make decisions, capacity to organize. Yeah, and I'm really excited about it. But at the same time, I think now that young people are active more visibly and more significantly, they have to deal with some of the paradoxes in Nepali society that have existed for years. For example, so far joining like a fellowship from the US Embassy or UK Embassy was okay because nobody really cared what the young people were doing. But now, because you're trying to garner all this legitimacy as a Nepali CSO or a Nepali activist, you have to be faced with questions like, are you taking dollars? Are you filling your pockets with dollars? Does that make you non-patriotic? And so some of the larger paradoxes that already existed, they have to come to terms with as well. And maybe because of their engagement in the public sphere, maybe those debates will get like different, newer perspectives and newer tangents, and maybe they'll end somewhere into a resolution.
Yeah,
hopefully.
I think what is really interesting is the way it seems there's a lot of space for more or new kinds of meaning making, right? There's lots of space to like have newer definitions or different definitions of things. And yeah, it's really for us as people who do research in political economy, it's very, what's going to come next is very interesting to be a part of, to witness and to talk about. Of course, yeah.
And yeah, like sometimes I just wanted to interject because sometimes like what comes next feels too contingent upon the newly elected government, and I don't like that. and that brings this idea of Gen Z continuing the ethos of this movement through organizing, and that makes it so important.
Yeah, I think what you said before of like, the visibility, like what shifted the most, I think, and I was having this conversation with a colleague yesterday, is how the visibility, like it almost seemed like young people were just not visible to, like, and so when they did come up after the movement, like the society had to face, it was like the society was in two fractions, let's say, if it was like an older fraction and a younger fraction. And then, they had to come face to face with each other, and they'd be like, oh, there you are, like, who are you? I think that was a really interesting, I tried to like create scenarios or metaphors in my head of the conversations I've had in the past, like at least within the 6 months after the movement, and that's really what I felt. I was like, we've always been here, and we've been doing things. It's just that nobody saw the young people, and yeah, to me that was a really interesting thing. That shift of because it was an intergenerational gap that was very present, which is why a lot of people had a very hard time understanding what happened and what is it that you want. But I think this whole process has been like sort of filling that gap.
Yeah. I think that's the end of our conversation.
Okay.
Okay, thank you so much, Anusha.
Thank you for having this conversation with me and for doing this research with me.